إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي.
Assalamu alaikum. The other thing you can do is you can just call Tariq and he'll let you know what's going on. No, don't do that. His phone already is busy. Jazakallah khair for being here on a Friday evening. It's always nice to see this many people who have a passion to learn and hear something about hopefully a topic that we can go ahead and correct some misinformation that's out there. The first one I want to do, inshallah, regarding Afghanistan is I'm sure that you probably over the last several weeks heard something on the lines of that this is a 20-year conflict. This was framed in this way by President Biden, who kept talking about how he wanted to pull the US forces out of Afghanistan after 20 years because, as you know, many people like anniversaries that end in a number 0. Of course it's not a 20-year conflict. And I'm sure that I don't have to remind anybody here, because looking at the audience, I think everyone is pretty well aware that the conflict in Afghanistan is at least 42 years old. That from just the sheer number of casualties and the trauma that it caused, not only in Afghanistan, but also in its neighboring countries as well, the kind of upheaval that it caused. It does it a disservice and an injustice to those who died to say that this is only a 20-year conflict. So as far as one of the talking points that I would encourage you to remember is that this is a longer and more protracted situation over there. Inshallah, what I'd like to do with our limited time today is to go through a little bit of history. I'm a historian, so I'm afraid you're stuck with me having to go back in time. And historians never go back in time just in decades, we go back in centuries. So I invite you to come on this journey with me in taking a look at Afghanistan as a graveyard of empires, and indeed it is. And in some ways this has been both the blessing and the curse to the Afghan people. Their geography has caused them to then be in the intersection of usually other imperial ambitions, and ones that have then led to the focus unduly being on this particular area. So okay, that's how we do it. So this is, well, I guess now we should say this is the old flag of Afghanistan, because I think the Taliban have different ideas on this. And of course, here is the map of Afghanistan. And I want you to pay close attention to the realization that it's not the only stan. It is surrounded by other stans or stans, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and then of course we have China, India, Pakistan, and Iran. And each of these countries does play a role in the way that Afghanistan has been historically and will continue to be as we move forward. Well, I told you we're going back in time, and we're literally going back about 2,300 years. The first empire to come through Afghanistan was, of course, the Macedonian Empire. Sometimes people call it the Greek Empire. Don't say that to a Macedonian. They will be upset. It's just like calling an Indian a Pakistani or vice versa, if you needed some frame of reference there. Sikandar, or Alexander the Great, came through here, and it was really in Afghanistan where he reached his outer limit. He was trying to expand into India by crossing the Hindu Kush. He was by and large unsuccessful and decided that this was where he would stop, and then he would head back. A few years after this, he of course died. And it's interesting that if you go to Afghanistan today, you will see the legacy of Sikandar and the Macedonians, in particularly the people of Kalash. Their features are not exactly what you would expect from this Central Asian area, and the legacy of Sikandar and his armies attest to that, especially when you see the blue eyes and the blonde hair. This is somebody from actually Jalalabad, which was the final center of Sikandar's reign there. It's a striking similarity to the depictions of Sikandar. And here's another depiction I thought, and thank you for wearing the hat, by the way.
I'm from Afghanistan, by the way.
Well, there you go. I mean, not from the Macedonian side, but I don't know if you knew this about the Pakul, but archaeologists have shown that if you see the coins and if you see the various sculptures of Macedonia, that they actually brought the Pakul to Afghanistan, that style of hat. So I can't speak about the scarf or the jacket here, but certainly the Pakul is from there. Well, I'm not going to stay 2,100 years, 2,300 years for very long. The next real idea of empire that we should concern ourselves is with really what happens in the 19th century. But I suppose it's still only fair to recognize that Afghanistan did have its moment under Islamic empires. After all, this was an area that was the expansion of the Umayyads and then particularly the Abbasids. And when the Seljuks came down from the Central Asian steppes, the area of Afghanistan became a fertile ground for them and an area of conquest. And everybody went through Afghanistan, including, of course, the Mongols on the way to Baghdad in 1258, including Temur, or Tamerlane, or Temur the Lame, or Tamerlane, who came through here. And every single group that came through had two features to them. One, they contributed to the genetic composition of the area. So if you were to do a 23andMe of people from Afghanistan, you would probably be all over the map. And the other thing about these empires is none of them were able to or willing to hold on to it. It was always like topsoil, it was churning over, and somebody else then came, usually with a sense of arrogance that they were going to be able to take it over. But the 19th century is where we find then the beginnings of European interest in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, Afghanistan became a proxy venue for other conflicts between other empires. One of the biggest ones there, of course, very close by, was the Russian Empire. And we have, by way of colonization, the start of the British influence in India. They weren't initially interested in Afghanistan. And quite frankly, in the 1830s, it wasn't Great Britain itself that was there, it was a corporation, the British East India Company, which had been in India since the 1700s. And so if you see the dates here, it's still before the Sepoy Mutiny, as many of you are probably familiar, which happened in 1857. That was a very important date because that is the time when the British East India basically said, our company said, we can't do this by ourselves anymore, and they handed India over to the British Crown. And from that point, it became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. But at this point, the British interest was really a corporate one. It was a private sector one in one of the largest and most powerful corporations in history. And inshallah, where's Tariq? I think we're going to be doing some lectures maybe in the winter on British India. Inshallah, yep. So I'll be talking about that in greater detail. In the meantime, if you would like some background reading and you haven't read it yet, there's an excellent book called The Anarchy, which is by William Dalrymple, who is a British Cambridge-educated historian. He splits his time between Delhi and England. And he's written some excellent books on South Asia. You might be familiar with things like The Last Mughal, The White Mughals, but his latest one is The Anarchy, which is a history of the British East India Company. If you'd like to get a jump start and read up on that, you have plenty of time by the time Tariq invites me back for those lectures, which will probably be inshallah in January, February. So yeah, you can finish a book like that in about 5 months. I know Mukim can finish it in 5 days. Yes?
Who's the author?
It's William Dalrymple, D-A-L-R-Y-M-P-L-E. If you get a chance, he's given several interviews about the book, which I think you can probably find on YouTube. The great thing about COVID is that everybody went on Zoom to give lectures about these things, and they're abundantly available. So I invite you, and don't mess with his Urdu, it's perfect. So he's one of these people that if you ever see standing around and you decide you're going to talk about him in order that you do so at your own peril, because he'll tell you a thing or two. The British and the Russians had by this time realized that Central Asia was very important to control. For the British, they had interests that spanned all the way to China. If you look at the dates here, 1830s to 1840s, this is right around the time of the so-called Opium Wars. And it is from around this time where the British and other European interests had established a foothold in places like Shanghai. Here in Central Asia, there was really the primary motivation of trying to create buffer areas, because the Russians and the British did not want one to then come too close to the other. They had established what was known as the Great Game. And part of this involved Iran, or the Persian Empire, leading all the way into World War I, when the Russians and the British literally split Iran into spheres of influence, Russia in the north, Britain in the south, leaving just a small band in the middle for being basically Iran as a neutral area to be a buffer between them. And so this was a strategy that that Europeans did quite amply. And if for some of you who remember the lecture series on the Ottoman Empire, we discussed how there was what was called the Greater Eastern Question, where the British, the French, and the Russians all were looking to weaken the Ottoman Empire. None of them wanted to take it by themselves because of the potential power vacuum, and they certainly didn't want one of the others to take it because it would have tilted the balance of power between them. So here we see then one of the big ploys by which the Europeans tried to then control areas. The British in this case put in a puppet regime with Shah Shuja, also known as Shah Durrani, onto the throne. What ends up happening, though, is that things didn't exactly go the way that the British wanted. The Russians intervene. Ultimately, it is an Afghan victory. The British have to withdraw. And the British learned something from this. They learned that the British East India Company was not capable of fighting wars that far away from India itself, and particularly in a place like Afghanistan, which is not exactly very amenable to the kind of warfare that the British, quite frankly, were not used to fighting. This is rough terrain. A different leader is now restored to the throne. This is Muhammad Dost, somebody whom the Afghans would have preferred to be their leader all along. But the British, as we well know, are anything but ones to give up. And in 1878, we find that the British are back in the Second Anglo-Afghan War. And here we find that the tensions between the British and the Russians have intensified. And it has something to do with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had what was called from 1873 to 1875 the Great Eastern Crisis. And in that time, the Ottoman Empire lost about a third of its territory and about a sixth of its population, thanks to what is known as the Congress of Berlin, which was a peace treaty. Well, the British and the Russians didn't exactly like the way that the terms of the Congress of Berlin went. No problem, we'll just create a new conflict somewhere else. And here we then find that the British now have the full force of the British Empire behind them. It is no longer just a corporation fighting the Russians, and Afghanistan then emerges as a buffer between Russia and British interests in India. And so I want you to become very attuned to this as a recurring theme. For those of you who are students or scholars of the Middle East, you know that this was also one of the plans when it comes to dividing up the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire. The British and the French didn't trust one another, and that is one of the reasons why you have Lebanon and Syria to the French, because the British wanted to buffer their interests in oil in Iraq and their other interests of the Suez Canal in Egypt, and then everything in the middle. Now, cartoons, especially political cartoons, are really instructive in understanding how people were absorbing the events of the time in real time. And here we find an Afghan in the middle. In fact, it's Amir Sher Ali. And here you've got the Russian bear on the left, and you have the British lion on the right. And he's saying, "Save me from my friends." And this was exactly the problem, that the British and the Russians would go ahead and ploy him with more and more favors and concessions and bribes if he would come on side or favor one against the other. This was an untenable position because, of course, somebody like Amir Sher Ali would realize that if he upset one, then the other would go ahead and take an advantage of that, and ultimately you're never going to be able to please both of them. But the great game, is exactly what is then the whole idea of colonialism, imperialism by European forces at this time. If it sounds as though it's cheapening it and calling it a game, in some ways I suppose that's true, because that's how the Europeans looked at this. They simply looked at it as a game. It was who could have leverage over the other person for resources, for power, and also for bragging rights. Now, moving on, Afghanistan pretty much lays low in the beginning of the 20th century. It is not a player during World War I. It is not a player during World War II. Everything changes after Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the United States launches 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. A lot of people think that the real purpose of those atomic weapons was to end the war in order to minimize more casualties. That's not exactly true, because the US had already bombed Tokyo very effectively. Something along the lines of 250,000 Japanese were killed there. What the atomic bombs were really trying to do was send a signal, true, but the signal was to the Soviet Union. Because here we find that the US and the UK recognized that after the war was over and after Hitler was going to be defeated in Germany, that the next big enemy was going to be Stalin in the Soviet Union. And so this was signaling to the Soviet Union that this is what we've got. And really, the 2 nuclear bombs are not the end of the Second World War as much as they are the opening shot of the Cold War. And the Cold War lasts from 1945 to 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I want you to see the map here, just to get an idea then of how the world was divided. And generally speaking, particularly the United States, decided that there was no such thing as a neutral zone. You were either with the US or by default you were with the Soviet Union. And there were efforts that were made by people like Nehru and Nasser and Tito and Sukarno to create a non-aligned movement. In 1955, they had a conference in Indonesia, in Bandung, called the Conference of the Non-Aligned States, or the Third World. But the US and the West really then started to pull more countries on side. Those that were seen as non-committal is where you find a lot of overthrows, a lot of coups. Guatemala, Congo, Ghana, Nigeria were just some of the areas that had to face that wrath by these. But you can see Afghanistan there, which is listed as USSR aligned. It didn't start that way in 1945. In fact, it wasn't that way in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. The 1970s is where things become a little bit more interesting. Now, here's just some statistics right now about Afghanistan, because people have no idea about how big it is and where it leans. 80 million population. It has a majority Sunni population, but of course there's a sizable Shi'i population in the west, especially near Iran's border. Mazar-e-Sharif, for example, is one area. It is still considered to be a federal republic, irrespective of who's in power, and it has actually a fairly high literacy rate. I know that in the Western media this is a shocking statistic, but it has an 85% literacy rate. The per capita income of Afghanistan is actually also fairly high at about 13,000. I'm sure that that has probably taken a hit. Their defense budget is 2.5% of GDP. But of course, we need to come up to the present tense and the present day and understanding where does Afghanistan fit in what we either remember or what is in our current understanding of Afghanistan. And basically from the 1970s on, Afghanistan has a legacy of occupation. and one that obviously is still not over. So let's look at 1973. And remember, you have to go back a little bit in time. Here we find the first coup d'etat that occurs, which really sets the stage then for the Soviet invasion in 1979. So this happened 6 years earlier than that. And here you have the king. Yes, Afghanistan was a monarchy. And here you have Mohammad Zahir Shah. And you see this correctly. He ruled Afghanistan for 40 years. Started before World War II and rules all the way till 1973. Here you have Mohammad Daoud Khan, who is the president, who takes over Afghanistan in what had become a fairly common practice now. Monarchies were becoming out of fashion. And there was this idea that if we can have a federal republic, have a democracy, this can help Afghanistan do two things. One, modernize more. And the second thing that people don't talk about a lot is that Afghanistan had a very thriving elite, but it was urban-based and it was very limited. We're familiar with the term 1% when it comes to the elite in this country. This probably was less than 0.5%. And the reason why I bring this point up is that when we hear a lot of the rhetoric today about Afghanistan, and a lot of the people who especially have been not only critical about the Taliban, but calling for intervention, invoking the issue of women and human rights, almost all of them are urban-based elites. Their familiarity with people living in rural areas and frontier areas of Afghanistan is probably zero. If they have any kind of familiarity with Afghanistan, it is Kabul, maybe Kandahar, maybe Herat, and maybe Jalalabad. It would be, for example, if somebody came from outside the United States and thought that the United States was only New York City. They didn't venture into Utah or Idaho or Wyoming. And of course, you realize how complicated our own domestic politics are when it comes to the idea that even the urban elites that live on the West and the East Coast don't really have their finger on the pulse of the heartland of America. Well, something like that is also the situation in Afghanistan. So now we have a federal republic. Now we have the king out of the way, so to speak. But that's not enough. The new president, Daoud Khan, is ineffective. He's ruled and deemed to be corrupt. And there is now a movement within Afghanistan that is more socialist-based to rid him of what was seen as no real improvement from the king. The king is removed, and now all of a sudden you have another urban elitist in the form of Daoud Khan. What emerges in 1978 in what is known as the Saud Revolution is a socialist government. And it wasn't just a socialist government, but one that really saw itself more aligned with the Soviet Union. Remember, Afghanistan is a landlocked country. It does not have a seaport. It is at the mercy of other countries around it, neighboring, particularly Pakistan and Iran, to have access to a seaport. As a result of it, it was then neighbored with a superpower. That superpower happened to be the Soviet Union. And the kind of socialist policies, along with the kind of aid packages that the Soviet Union was more than willing to give it, allowed Afghanistan to lean toward Moscow, especially when you have Nur Muhammad Taraki, who was a socialist leader in Afghanistan. Now, whether or not that was eventually going to work remains to be seen. The Taraki government panicked because there was now a significant amount of opposition still, as oftentimes happens in the chaos of a revolution, and he then hits the panic button. And the Soviet Union is only too happy to come in and intervene and keep propped up his government in Kabul. And so it is actually in December of 1978 where we find then the first Soviet advisors and troops come in to prop up the Taraki regime in Kabul. Now, you're familiar with the Biden doctrine, the Eisenhower doctrine, the Truman doctrine, the Nixon doctrine, the Bush doctrine. In America, every president has a doctrine. Well, similarly, the Soviet Union had a doctrine, the Brezhnev doctrine, who was the premier in Moscow at this time. And he said, any country, especially a socialist-leaning country that is in peril, we will come in and help support. Again, in the same way that the U.S. justified many of its interventions. Some of you are probably familiar with NATO. There was also CENTO, known as the Baghdad Pact, which had the US, UK, Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan in it as well, which was a defense configuration. And then there was SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. So the US had as part of its policy that any country which was threatened by communism, they would intervene and either militarily or financially or both provide aid. So the Soviet Union was doing this, at least this was the pretense by which they intervened in 1978. Of course, like in the case of American interventions, whether it was Vietnam or Afghanistan later, this took on a different dimension. Now, how many of you remember the Soviet invasion? Few of you? The rest of you don't? You read about it? Okay. Some of you are clearly old enough to have been around, and yeah? You just don't want to give away your age? Okay. That's fine. If you don't want to disclose your age. I was 12 years old when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and I remember it very well. If you were watching the news in the United States in 1979, you might remember that everything was focused on the Soviet Union. This menacing communist superpower was now invading involuntarily an innocent, helpless state. And that, of course, then set up the whole idea that the United States must intervene and do something about it. You might remember that in 1980, the US decided to boycott the Moscow Summer Olympic Games as a protest against that, even though the US had and hosted Moscow and other Soviet bloc countries in Lake Placid that winter. In fact, the US beat the Soviet hockey team, the Miracle on Ice, if you remember. And everything back then was a Cold War proxy war. Two hockey teams fighting on the ice is a metaphor for war. Well, the whole idea of then framing this war was a function not in Kabul, but in the halls of power in Washington. The president back then was not Reagan yet, it was Jimmy Carter. And there was a conscious decision on how to then sell the war to the US public and also to American allies. And of course, this must sound quite familiar when it comes to other military interventions. For those of you who also remember, 1979 was a pivotal year in the Muslim world for two other reasons. What two things happened? Iran, okay, you got one. The Makkah attack, absolutely. Wow, good audience tonight. So, January 16th, we find the Shah leaves Iran for good. February the 1st, Khomeini comes back triumphant from Paris. Later on in the year, we have then the storming of the US Embassy and the taking of hostages. 52 remaining hostages were held for 444 days, and they were released on January the 20th, 1981, as Ronald Reagan took office and was inaugurated. But in the fall of 1979, quite rightly, as you said, the Haram Sharif in Mecca was stormed by Saudis. And initially, the Saudis blamed it on Iran as a reflexive action, mostly because they didn't know what was going on. In fact, they didn't know that the Haram had been stormed until the US told them, because the US actually had the only non-Saudi telephone network connected line straight to Washington. When that happened, there was then this paranoia among the Saudis and Gulf states that Khomeiniism was going to spread around the Gulf and it was going to threaten their regimes. But the bigger concern after the storming of Mecca for the Saudis was that their own people didn't care for them, and that there were people who were framing this in theological terms, that the Saudi regime was corrupt, that the Saudi regime was un-Islamic, and this was a movement that was felt and was being proselytized in other parts of the Muslim world. Well, Afghanistan created then the perfect script for dealing with a lot of problems. The number one thing going around was what to do with our own radicals, or the way that people define radicals. You had in Washington a national security advisor in Zbigniew Brzezinski. He died a couple of years ago. You probably have maybe seen his daughter on morning MSNBC with Joe Scarborough. Mika Brzezinski is Zbigniew Brzezinski's daughter. Brzezinski was a very, very smart man, but he also understood the Cold War better than anybody else. Another thing happened in 1979, which then helps also understand Afghanistan at this point. There was a labor union in Poland called Solidarity, which grew from the docks of Gdansk. And they were starting to protest living conditions, working conditions in Poland. And particularly their protests were centered around and targeting a man by the name of Jaruzelski, who was not only the leader of Poland, but was essentially a puppet of Moscow, because Poland was part of the Warsaw Pact and within the Soviet sphere of influence. Well, Brzezinski sees this and capitalizes on it. He then makes a hero of the leader of this movement, a man by the name of Lech Walesa, who I think came to Oakland University 2 years ago to give a talk. The other way that he was going to leverage and create some mischief for the Soviet Union in Poland was to leverage the fact that for the first time in history, a Polish pope had been elected, John Paul II. So the United States was going to use soft power, both in propping up a labor union, and then also to prop up the fact that you have a Polish pope. Brzezinski himself was Polish, so he said that not only is this good politics, not only is this good foreign policy, but he had a personal stake in it as well. On the Polish side, you have that going on. When you bring the Pope into any situation, you're automatically framing it as the godly versus the godless communists in the Soviet Union. Similarly, now there's an opportunity to frame the Afghan conflict in those terms. The Soviet Union is godless, they're atheist, they're Marxist, they're coming into Afghanistan. Why don't we make this a battle between the bad guys and the good guys who are godly and religiously observant? I don't know what the landscape was in Afghanistan as far as how pious the people of Afghanistan or how observant they are at the time. It didn't matter, because now what you could do is literally frame this as a freedom movement of people who were motivated by God. I give you then the Mujahideen. The whole notion of how the Afghan freedom fighters became the Mujahideen was not self-defined by the Mujahideen. This was something that was decided in Washington. Okay. Now, the other great thing that happened about this is recognizing that they needed to turn the temperature down of the heat in places like Egypt, which had just emerged from the Camp David Accords, and some people were less than happy about that. The pressure that the Saudis were feeling and the real fear that this would serve as a ripple effect across the Muslim world, leaving them vulnerable to not necessarily radicals, but Soviet influence emerging in there, is to say, no problem. You've got some Looney Tunes in your own countries, just outsource them. Send them to Afghanistan. They've got somewhere to go now. And so here then we find a lot of committed people who decided that since this is a religious imperative, let's then go ahead, if you're naming it, naming us Mujahideen, well then that basically means that you've declared this to be a jihad. And so what's wrong with then being a mujahid ourselves? So they end up in Afghanistan. Some of these people include the 52nd child of the richest construction baron in all of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Laden, a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden. Another person who shows up there is an Egyptian pediatrician by the name of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is now, by the way, the head of Al-Qaeda. Back then, he wasn't even the deputy. There was no Al-Qaeda. So this is how the Mujahideen then end up in Afghanistan, with full support by the US CIA Pakistan and the Saudis. Pakistan was really now put into a situation where they were really the only conduit for supplies into Afghanistan. And there was a new leader in Pakistan after the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto on April the 4th of 1979. Here you have, of course, General Zia-ul Haq, who was there, who was only too willing to accept Saudi money, American gratitude, and a little bit more street credibility in the world. The total number of Soviet and Afghan fighters, meaning those who were loyal to the Kabul regime, was 650,000. That's not a small number of people and personnel in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen forces were less than half of that, 250,000. And here we see that in the 10-year conflict from 1979 to 1989, the Soviet army suffered 15,000 casualties. About 18,000 were Afghan regime fighters. The Mujahideen incurred somewhere between 90 to 180,000 casualties, 6,000 Pakistani casualties, and as far as the number of civilians, and this is still a very, very conservative estimate, somewhere between 560,000 to 2 million Afghan civilians perished in a 10-year war. And the only thing that happened was in 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew. It also caused a massive refugee crisis. 3 million refugees ended up in Pakistan. Another 2 million refugees were internally displaced within Afghanistan itself because of the chaos that was occurring. It is not an exaggeration to say that Afghanistan led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. There's two things that did it. One was the Soviet invasion and occupation and failure in Afghanistan, so that was an external thing. And the other thing happened 3 years before that. Anyone know? 1986?
No, USSR broke.
No, Gorbachev broke in 89. Gorbachev had come in about 1984. Yeah.
I think it was Chernobyl.
It was Chernobyl. Yeah. Afghanistan exposed the Soviet Union's military weakness in an asymmetric war, and Chernobyl exposed its infrastructure weakness. And in fact, Gorbachev, in his memoir, said to that effect that these are the two things that caused the collapse. So if you haven't seen it yet, there's an HBO miniseries called Chernobyl. It's a five-piece series. It is some of the most gripping television you'll ever watch. So strongly recommend that. Well, here's bin Laden as a member of the Mujahideen. The jacket is, of course, supplied by the United States. All of those are, I guess, Army surplus stuff that you can probably buy at Dave's Army Surplus now on Woodward in Royal Oak. And there's the pakul in full display there. He was particularly prominent because of his height. He was about 6'3" and certainly stood out in a crowd. And here is another picture which I think is really dramatic. Here you have the Afghan Mujahideen having lunch in front of a downed Soviet helicopter. And you know, the helicopter is such a vivid image because for those of you who are looking at the symmetry of it, it was one of the iconic images of America's failure in Vietnam. The Huey helicopter and the wreckage around it. So remarkable parallels between these two conflicts. Well, 1989, the Soviet Union leaves, and it also coincides with the fall of the Berlin Wall. I don't know if you remember that, but I remember CNN just went berserk. They literally were broadcasting every night from the Berlin Wall, watching people chip away at it, dancing on top of it, holding concerts there, just waiting for the prospect of it to completely come down, both for symbolic reasons, because it had been there for 28 years, and also what it really meant that the Soviet Union no longer had the kind of influence that it once did over East Germany and the rest of the Soviet bloc. This was the dominoes falling, which was what the West had dreamt of since 1945. But then what about Afghanistan? Afghanistan is then ignored completely by the West. There's a person who you will probably be familiar with when I say her name, because she was George W. Bush's national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice. Well, in 1989, she had a job with his daddy. She was George H.W. Bush's Russia expert. And she told George H.W. Bush, the Soviet Union is collapsing, we need to go into Eastern Europe and collect our spoils. Doesn't matter that our Western European allies are there, and they could certainly do it, and they had more of a right to be there. No, we got to go in there. There's just too much opportunity. And that was that great advice, which also, of course, was asleep at the wheel on September the 10th, 2001, but that's a whole different story, that then led to the US saying, yeah, we can leave Afghanistan alone to its own devices. Part of that, of course, has to do with racism. The fact that they never really saw Afghanistan or Afghans as being worth fighting. This was just to go ahead and fight a proxy war and have the locals do the fighting for them, the heavy lifting. But there really wasn't any idea of the prospect of any kind of geostrategic, geopolitical, or commercial interest in Afghanistan. There were no natural resources, they thought, that would be there. China at this point was still in a sleeping giant. Tiananmen Square had happened in 1988. It was still seen as an autocratic regime, not a threat at all. The bigger threat from the Far East was not China, it was the Japanese juggernaut economically. That power vacuum could have been avoided. It was not. And as a result of it, Afghanistan plunges into utter chaos when you have all of these different factions there. The government has collapsed. I mean, it tries to stumble along, but it is completely ineffective. When it came to the Mujahideen, they all left. They went back home. They were victorious. They got rid of a superpower. There's very few people who can ever claim that. And on top of that, they said, well, we've got business at home to take care of. We've got other disputes that are at home. And if we can take care of the Soviet Union, a bunch of al-Sauds and al-Sabahs and Hosni Mubarak are pretty much small potatoes. We'll go try our luck with that. It's amazing what victory does to the psyche. But Afghanistan suffers as a result of it and has a series of civil wars. And here you see a graphic where there was not just one civil war. These were different phases. So the first one was in 1989 and it lasted till about 1992. And here you find that the regime is still in power. And you can imagine how the Kabul regime must have felt. Their big benefactors, their walis, the Soviet army, is gone. Again, parallels to the U.S. leaving Bagram in the dead of night. So you can see a lot of things that are very similar here. Well, the regime is fighting. You still have some Mujahideen who are around. They're still well armed and well equipped from CIA weapons, and they're able to then topple the Kabul regime. From 1992 to 1996, it becomes Mujahideen versus Mujahideen, and particularly factions that are there that are Afghan. These are not the Saudis, these are not the Egyptians who have already gone home, and this is where you have the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Pashtuns all looking for who now has the dibs on Kabul. That, of course, is presuming that Afghanistan could be governed from a central government. While this is happening, and particularly in about 1993, 1994, kids who had grown up as refugees when the crisis had already begun in 1979, some having been born in Pakistan, but certainly having been raised there in the refugee camps, come of age. They realize that there is chaos happening in their own countries. They feel particularly motivated to go do something. They have been financed in part by the Saudis, who have run madrasas and provided other kind of aid, and these then become known as the students, the Talib or the Taliban. So the Taliban are born literally in the refugee camps of Pakistan. They cross a rather permeable border into Afghanistan and say, this is our country, this is our territory, these are our people, this is our future, and this is our right. And so they then intervene in the civil war, and they prevail. They prevail over the Haqqani network, they prevail over a number of different disparate groups, and take control over the country in 1996. When this happens, there's only 3 countries in the world that recognize formally the Taliban regime in Kabul: Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. But don't be fooled just when it comes to formal recognition. The United States may not have recognized the Taliban officially, but they were certainly negotiating with them. And in fact, you can't actually Photoshop anything better than this. This is the home in Houston, actually Sugarland, for those of you who know the Houston area a little bit better. So further down 59 past Agaz. Yeah. Okay. At the home of the vice president of UNOCAL, Marty Miller, and he looks all kinds of happy because the Taliban are his negotiating partners for gas and oil pipelines. Their biggest competition was an Argentine company which was looking to get the contracts for this. And these negotiations were not just in 1998, they continued all the way till August of 2001, where the Taliban were meeting in the penthouse suite at the Astroland Hotel in Houston next to the Astrodome, right off 610, for those of you who are familiar with that area. I don't think Agaz was around yet, otherwise that would have been a place to go. Well, I said August of 2001, and of course the very next month is the September 11th attacks. And bin Laden goes ahead and claims responsibility for them. Now, how does this, of course, include and involve the Taliban? Well, the Taliban were essentially harboring Al-Qaeda. They were harboring Osama bin Laden, who was related now by marriage to the leader of the Taliban. Right before Ahmad Shah Massoud on September the 10th, who was the leader of the main resistance and defiance to the Taliban, had been assassinated. Conventional wisdom on the behest of bin Laden. And because the Taliban said, we have no reason to give up Al-Qaeda, they haven't done anything to us, that refusal pretty much sealed the fate not only of the Taliban, but of Afghanistan itself. And really by its neighbors. I think it was former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage is said to have gone to then Pakistani leader General Musharraf and given him an ultimatum, saying that if you don't let us come through Pakistan, you're done. The fact that he had that level of bravado to not only say that to another world leader, but to say that to a world leader who actually had a nuclear arsenal, shows the level of indignation that the United States had and the sheer and abject insistence that they needed to do something. For those of you who remember, in the days after 9/11, it was like an obsession. Something had to be done. Someone had to pay the price, no matter the collateral damage. Well, that started in 2001 and went for 20 years. The question is, if the mission was to get Al-Qaeda, that was pretty much taken care of within the first 3 years. By 2003, 2004, Al-Qaeda was no longer a presence and certainly not a threat, at least emanating from Afghanistan. What it did do, though, is it spread everywhere else. And while the Bush administration had said very emphatically, we want to fight the war there so it doesn't come here, it just created a metastatic effect where Al-Qaeda then franchised itself to Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. You have people like Abu Musab Zarqawi, who launches attacks even in Jordan. So the fact that it was just still not happening in the US was all that Washington really cared about. But in 2011, they finally got bin Laden in Pakistan, in Abbottabad, as many of you know, right across the street from the Pakistan Military Academy, because, you know, where else would he be? Well, the United States then does what the United States likes to do, and that is install democracy. But of course, that democracy is those who are amenable to the United States. And here you have the two presidents who have served Afghanistan in the last 20 years. Hamid Karzai, and then more recently, Ashraf Ghani. Ghani himself was actually at Johns Hopkins and at Columbia University and was a consultant for the World Bank. Pretty impressive resume, to be sure. Again, a couple of urban elites probably gave a really good story to the United States that we understand Afghanistan, we're going to go ahead and govern Afghanistan, we've got this one, and the US heard what it wanted to without realizing that they had no idea about 99% of the country and how it ruled. What have been the US's main policy concerns there? Security and terrorism, corruption, of course, regional conflicts, the drug trade, which in part the CIA helped broker, and then also minerals and natural resources. Afghanistan is sitting on probably about $2 trillion of natural resources, including many things that go into your devices, lithium, copper, oil and natural gas is actually fairly minimal compared to that. This is a pretty dramatic image of what the Afghan citizen would have thought about the US presence in Afghanistan, military surveillance through the whole time. But there were efforts at peace. When the occupation was not going as smoothly as the US would have liked, in the very end of the Trump administration, and credit has to be given where credit is due, the Trump administration said outwardly what the United States always wanted to do, and that is leave Afghanistan. Trump's indelicate way of putting it actually was, in this case, a little bit more candid. And he sends Zalmay Khalilzad, who has been around the whole Afghan thing since 2001. His wife is Cheryl Bernard, who works at the RAND Corporation, which is a major defense think tank in Washington, and she's a total neocon. She actually had a report back in 2007 about how Muslims should be tamed. But in Doha, Qatar, the Taliban were invited by the Trump administration for peace.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح.
So this was America's exit strategy. This actually ended up being more of what the exit looked like. If you want to know the cost of the war, here's a breakdown. Estimates are that between the Afghan war and the Iraq war, the US spent $6 trillion with a T dollars. The vast majority of people killed in the war were not American by any stretch of the imagination. They were Afghani and Pakistani. If you look on the graph on the right, you can see the number of US in blue and everybody else just in comparison. It's really staggering. And here you see how many civilians particularly were killed. You're going to hear a lot, if you haven't already, that pretty much lumps in ISIS-K, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the Haqqani network as one big group of bad guys. In about a 30-day period, I probably did something along the lines of about 42 interviews on various media outlets, some 2 to 3 a day, some even when I was in Lisbon. And it was interesting because the American media only wanted one question answered. Who's to blame for the chaos and the ineptitude of the pullout? And the Chinese wanted to know, can you help us explain what's the difference between ISIS-K, Al-Qaeda, Haqqani network, and Taliban? I said, bless you. ISIS-K is ISIS of Khorasan province. They are former Taliban members who disagree with the way the Taliban are handling things. They just want more violence. Al-Qaeda, of course, was in Afghanistan under Taliban protection. The Taliban no longer like Al-Qaeda. They find them to be bad for business. The Haqqani network are part of the Taliban government. But these groups are also ideologically different. Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K are more Salafi. The Taliban and the Haqqani network are more Deobandi influenced. And so there are ideological differences. There's also focus. ISIS-K is a local franchise of a broader international network of mayhem. Al-Qaeda the same. The Taliban and the Haqqani network are only interested in Afghanistan, and they don't pose any threat outside of Afghanistan, no matter what American media paints them to be. I told you that the US spent $6 trillion on 2 wars over 20 years. In that same amount of time, China spent 1.5 trillion, or 1/4, to build the Silk Road. Both by land and by sea. And today, I think it was today or yesterday, the US had a meeting, the Biden administration had a meeting with Japan, Australia, and India for the so-called Quad. The Quad's only purpose is to try to push back on the Silk Road, along with that really stupid, where's my French friend back there? Is he there? Okay. The whole thing with the French and the submarines, which was an absolute disaster. Well, here's high-level diplomacy as well. It's not just about meeting with the Biden administration. Here you have the Taliban open for business, and the Chinese have been meeting with the Taliban now for several months. Here we have Mullah Baradar, who was at Doha, also meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Tianjin. The Chinese are perfectly fine with taking them seriously. That is going to be a very big deal when it comes to China's Silk Road ambitions, and also the way that the Taliban are going to have to operate within certain parameters of discipline and responsibility. Here I thought is a nice graphic of showing the Taliban chalking another one up when it comes to empires. And as I said, there's never a good time nor ever a good way to leave. And here, of course, the Afghans are telling Biden, well, you decide. And if you're interested in some books on Afghanistan, here they are. I'm leaving my slides on this laptop, so inshallah, if anybody would like them, just speak to the youth, tech experts, and you can have the slides. Are we breaking for Isha now, or? Yes. Okay, and inshallah, we can come back and I'll take any questions you have, okay? Jazakallah khair.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي